The salt flats weren't always dead. There was a time, years ago, when that land had grown crops just like the rest of Red Valley. Wheat, corn, soybeans, rows stretching out under the sun, green and strong. But that was before the water changed. It started slowly, a shift no one noticed at first. The irrigation water coming down from the northern canal began carrying more minerals, more salt. At first, it didn't matter. The soil absorbed it. The crops still grew. But over time, the salt stayed. Year after year, it built up, layer by layer. Invisible at first, then not. The edges of fields began to turn pale, a faint white crust forming along the surface. Farmers noticed, but they weren't worried. Just needs a good flush, they said. Next season will fix it. It didn't. By the third year, patches of land stopped producing. Small at first, then larger. Plants grew weaker. Roots struggled. Yields dropped. By the fifth year, the truth was impossible to ignore. The soil was dying. At Miller's feed store, the conversations turned serious. It's spreading. Half my south field won't grow anything. Same here. One farmer slammed his hand on the counter. It's the water. Another shook his head. Or the soil's just done. The older man behind the counter spoke quietly. It's salt. The word hung in the air. Because everyone knew what it meant. Salt didn't just hurt soil. It ruined it. Once it built up deep enough, there was no easy fix. Farmers started making decisions. Hard ones. Fields were abandoned. One by one. Equipment moved elsewhere. Land left to sit. Some tried to fight it. Leaching the soil with fresh water. Adding treatments. Rotating crops. But the results were the same. Temporary at best. By the sixth year, most of the salt flats were empty. Land that had once fed families now sat white and cracked under the sun. And everyone agreed on one thing. It wasn't worth saving. Everyone except one man. His name was Daniel Mercer. He stood at the edge of his field one evening, looking out across the pale ground. The salt shimmered faintly under the setting sun. The wind carried dust across the surface. Nothing moved. Nothing grew. Behind him, Tom Whitaker leaned against his truck. "You're still here?" Tom said. Daniel nodded. "Yeah." Tom looked out across the land. "You've seen what's happening?" Daniel nodded again. "I have." Tom crossed his arms. "Then why stay?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked forward. Kneeling down, he scooped a handful of soil from the surface. White crystals clung to the dirt. He rubbed it between his fingers, then let it fall. "Because it's not dead," he said. Tom shook his head. "Looks dead to me." Daniel stood. "Only the top is." Tom frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Daniel pointed toward the ground. "The salt's building up on the surface." He paused. "But that doesn't mean the whole soil profile is ruined." Tom stared at him. "You really believe that?" Daniel nodded. "I do." Tom let out a breath. "You're the only one." That was true, because by then, every other farmer had already made their choice. They left. Land was sold cheap. Some to developers. Some to investors. Some just abandoned completely. Machines moved to better ground. Water redirected. Effort shifted elsewhere. And Daniel Mercer stayed. The first year alone was the hardest. Not because of the work, but because of the silence. Where there had once been neighbors, there was nothing. No tractors running in nearby fields. No dust rising in the distance. No voices carrying across the land. Just wind. And salt. People still came by sometimes. Mostly out of curiosity. One afternoon, a group of farmers stood along the fence line watching Daniel work. "You really think you can fix this?" one of them asked. Daniel didn't stop. "I'm not fixing it." The man frowned. "Then what are you doing?" Daniel adjusted the equipment behind him. "I'm changing it." They laughed. Not cruelly. Not harshly. Just dismissively. "Good luck with that," someone said. Daniel didn't respond. Because he knew something they didn't. Or at least, he believed he did. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with maps spread out in front of him. Soil charts. Drainage diagrams. Old research papers. Notes written by hand. He had been studying the problem for months. Before everyone else gave up. Before the land turned completely white. Because he had noticed something early. The salt wasn't random. It followed patterns. Low areas. Flat zones. Places where water sat longer. And that meant something. Because if water was bringing the salt in, then water could take it out. But not the way most people were trying. Flooding the fields wasn't working. The salt just came back. Because it wasn't leaving the system. It needed somewhere to go. And Daniel had an idea. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast, and it definitely wasn't cheap, but it was possible. The next morning, he started digging. Not trenches for planting, not irrigation lines. Drainage channels. Deep, narrow, precise, cutting through the soil in long, calculated paths. At first, it didn't make sense to anyone watching. You're digging holes in dead land. Tom asked. Daniel nodded. Yeah. Tom shook his head. That's a new one. But Daniel kept going. Day after day, week after week. He dug. Then he laid pipes. Perforated drainage lines buried beneath the surface, connected to larger channels, leading away from the fields. Slowly, a system began to form, not for bringing water in, but for taking it out. The first rain came a month later. Not heavy, just enough to soak the ground. Daniel stood in the field as the water settled, watching, waiting, because this was the test. The water seeped into the soil, moved downward, and then, something different happened. Instead of sitting on the surface, it kept moving, to the drainage lines, carrying something with it. Salt. It wasn't visible at first, but over the next few days, the surface changed. Slightly, the white crust thinned, just a little. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Daniel did, and that was enough, because it meant he was right. The land wasn't dead. It was trapped, and now, it had a way to breathe again. The next year, he planted. Not everything, not all at once, just a small section. And what grew there wasn't impressive, not at first, but it was something, green, in a field that had been white. The farmers who saw it didn't believe it. They drove by, slowed down, stared. That can't be real. It won't last. He just got lucky. Daniel didn't argue. He just kept working, because he knew something they didn't. This wasn't a quick fix. It was a long game, and he had already committed. Years passed. Slowly, quietly, the drainage system expanded. More fields, more channels, more control. The salt kept moving, little by little, and every year, the green grew. Small at first, then larger, then undeniable. But no one admitted it. Not yet, because in their minds, the salt flats were still dead, and Daniel Mercer was still wasting his time. Until the day, everything changed. The change didn't come all at once. It never does. It came slowly, quietly, the kind of change you don't notice day to day, until one day you look up and realize everything is different. By the third year, Daniel's fields no longer looked like part of the salt flats. Not entirely. There were still patches of white, still areas where nothing grew. But between them, green, rows of crops pushing through soil that had once been written off as dead. At first, people said it was temporary. A good season, right conditions, beginner's luck. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't need to, because he wasn't chasing one good season. He was building something that would last. The drainage system expanded. That was the real work. Not planting, not harvesting, but digging, planning, adjusting. Every field had to be understood. Not just the surface, but what was happening beneath it, where water moved, where it stayed, where it carried salt. Daniel mapped everything, every slope, every low point, every shift in soil texture. He walked the land constantly, taking notes, making adjustments. Some days, it felt like nothing was changing, like all the effort was disappearing into the ground. But then, it would rain, and the water would move, and the salt would follow. Little by little, the white faded, not gone, but weaker. By the fourth year, something else happened. The crops got stronger, not just surviving, growing. Roots pushed deeper, leaves thickened, yields increased. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to notice. And people did. One afternoon, Tom Whitaker pulled up along the edge of Daniel's property again. But this time, he didn't lean on the fence. He stepped inside. "You've got half this field green now," Tom said. Daniel nodded. "About that." Tom looked around. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Beyond Daniel's land, the flats stretched out white and empty, dead, silent. But here, there was life. How? Tom asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. He knelt down, digging into the soil again. This time, it looked different. Less crust, more structure. "It's not about removing the salt all at once," Daniel said. "It's about moving it." Tom frowned. "Moving it where?" Daniel pointed toward the drainage channels. "Away." Tom followed the line with his eyes, then looked back at the field. "You're telling me all this?" He gestured around. "It's just from water moving the right way?" Daniel shook his head slightly. "Not just water." He stood. "It's time." Tom let out a slow breath. Most people didn't have that kind of time. Daniel nodded. I know. That was the truth. Most farmers couldn't afford to wait years for land to recover. They needed results. Now. So they left. And Daniel stayed. Because he had no other choice. But now, that choice was starting to look different. By the 5th year, the valley faced a new problem. Not salt. Water. The northern canal that had fed the farms for decades started to change again. Less flow. More restrictions. Higher costs. The same water that had once brought life was becoming harder to get. Farmers who had moved to better land now found themselves competing for limited supply. Irrigation schedules tightened. Costs rose. Access became unpredictable. At Miller's feed store, the conversations returned. But this time, the tone was different. They cut my allocation again. Same here. I can't run the pivots like this. Tom stood at the counter, shaking his head. Never thought water would be the problem. The older man behind the counter spoke quietly. It always is. Meanwhile, Daniel's farm kept running. Not because he had more water, but because he needed less. The drainage system didn't just remove salt. It changed how the soil held moisture. Water didn't sit on the surface anymore. Didn't evaporate as quickly. Didn't leave salt behind. It moved through the soil. Stayed where it mattered. Fed the roots. Daniel irrigated less. Used less. Needed less. And that made all the difference. By the 6th year, people started coming back. Not to farm. Not yet. But to look. They walked along the edges of Daniel's fields. Stood where they had once laughed. And said nothing. Because now, there was nothing to laugh at. Only questions. One farmer finally asked it. You think this could work on my land? Daniel looked at him. Then at the salt flats beyond. It can, he said. The man hesitated. Why didn't you tell anyone before? Daniel shrugged. I tried. The man nodded slowly. Because he remembered. They all did. But back then, no one listened. Now, they were ready to. By the 7th year, the shift had begun. Small at first. One farmer tried a drainage line. Another tested a section. Then another. Not everyone. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to change the conversation. The salt flats were no longer seen as lost. They were seen as recoverable, difficult, slow, but possible. And at the center of it all was Daniel Mercer, the man who stayed, the man who dug, the man who waited, the man they once laughed at. One evening, Tom stood beside him again. They looked out across the fields. More green now than white. More life than death. You know what the funny part is? Tom said. Daniel glanced at him. What? Tom smiled slightly. You didn't just fix your land. He gestured toward the valley. You showed everyone else how to fix theirs. Daniel didn't respond. Because he wasn't thinking about the valley. He was thinking about the years. The work. The doubt. And how close it all came to being nothing. The sun dipped low over the horizon. The fields caught the light. Green against white. Life against what used to be. And in that moment, it was clear. The salt flats weren't dead. They had just been waiting. For someone patient enough to bring them back. But the biggest change still hadn't come yet. Because what happened next would make Daniel Mercer something no one ever expected. By the 8th year, no one called it the salt flats anymore. At least not the way they used to. The name had meant something once. Failure. Abandonment. Deadland. A place people left behind. Now, it meant something else. Potential. But that change didn't come easily. It didn't come quickly. And it didn't come without resistance. Because even after Daniel proved it could be done, not everyone was ready to believe it. Some farmers tried. And failed. Not because the method didn't work. But because they didn't follow it all the way through. They dug shallow channels. Skipped steps. Rushed the process. Expected quick results. And when the salt came back, they said the same thing. Doesn't work. Daniel heard it. Of course he did. Word always made its way back to him. But he didn't argue. Because he understood something they didn't. This wasn't a shortcut. It was a system. And systems only work if you respect them. One afternoon, a farmer named Luke showed up at Daniel's property. Frustrated. Tired. Covered in dust. I did what you said, Luke said. It didn't work. Daniel looked at him. What did you do? Luke explained. He had dug drainage lines. Laid pipes. Ran water through the fields. Daniel listened. Then asked one question. How deep? Luke hesitated. About a foot. Daniel nodded. That's your problem. Luke frowned. What difference does that make? Daniel walked out into the field. Knelt down. And pushed his hand into the soil. The salt isn't just on top, he said. It moves up from below. He stood. If you don't go deep enough. He paused. You're not removing it. Luke stared at him. You're just moving it around. The realization hit slowly. Then all at once. Luke looked back at his truck. Then at Daniel. How deep, he asked. Daniel pointed toward the ground. Deep enough to change everything. And that was the difference. Daniel hadn't just worked harder than everyone else. He had worked differently. He had committed to the process. All of it. Every step. Every detail. Even when it didn't make sense. Even when it didn't show results. Even when everyone else had already given up. And now, that difference was impossible to ignore. Because by the 8th year, the valley faced another shift. Not water. Not salt. But land. Developers started coming in. The salt flats had been cheap. Worth almost nothing for years. But now, with signs of recovery, that changed. Land prices began to rise. Slowly at first. Then faster. Investors saw opportunity. Developers saw expansion. And suddenly, the land no one wanted became the land everyone wanted. Offers were made. Quietly at first. Then more aggressively. Farmers who had left the flats started coming back. Not all of them to farm. Some just to sell. Because the land they once abandoned was now worth more than it had been in decades. And at the center of it all was Daniel Mercer. The man who never left. The man who turned dead land into something alive again. One morning, a black SUV rolled up to his property. Clean. Shiny. Out of place. A man in a pressed suit stepped out. Looked around. Took in the fields. The drainage system. The green stretching across what had once been white. Mr. Mercer, he said, extending his hand. Daniel shook it. What can I do for you? The man smiled. I represent a development group interested in acquiring land in this area. Daniel nodded. I figured. The man glanced across the fields again. We're prepared to make you a very competitive offer. Daniel didn't ask how much. Didn't show interest. Didn't react. He just waited. The man continued. This land has significant potential now. Daniel looked at him. Now. The man smiled politely. Yes. Daniel nodded slowly. Funny how that works. The man didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because they both understood. This land had only become valuable. Because Daniel made it that way. The man opened a folder. Pulled out a document. Take a look, he said. Daniel didn't take it. I'm not selling. The man blinked. You haven't even seen the offer. Daniel shook his head. Don't need to. The man hesitated. This is a substantial amount of money. Daniel nodded. I believe you. The man closed the folder slowly. May I ask why? Daniel looked out across the fields. At the rows of green. At the system beneath the soil. At everything he had built. Then he answered. Because I didn't do all this. He paused. To hand it over. The man studied him for a moment. Then nodded. I understand. But he didn't. Not really. Because to him, it was land. An asset. An investment. To Daniel, it was something else. It was time. Years of it. Years of work no one saw. Years of failure no one noticed. Years of belief no one shared. And that wasn't something you sold. Not like that. After the man left. Tom showed up. Let me guess, Tom said. Offer. Daniel nodded. Big one. Daniel shrugged. Probably. Tom smiled. You turn it down? Daniel nodded again. Tom laughed. Figured. They stood in silence for a moment. Looking out across the land. You know what you are now? Tom asked. Daniel glanced at him. What? Tom grinned. The only one who saw it coming. Daniel shook his head. No. Tom frowned. No. Daniel looked out at the fields again. I'm just the one who stayed long enough to see it through. Tom nodded slowly. Because that was the truth. Not luck. Not timing. Just staying. Staying when it was hard. Staying when it made no sense. Staying when everyone else left. And that made all the difference. By the end of that season, the valley was green again. Not completely. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough to prove something. Enough to change everything. Farmers who had once laughed now followed the system. Drainage lines spread across the flats. Water moved differently. Salt faded. And the land came back. One field at a time. 1 year at a time. One decision at a time. And at the center of it all, Daniel Mercer stood. Not as the richest farmer. Not as the biggest landowner. But as something else. The one who understood. The one who waited. The one who proved. That land doesn't die easily. It just needs someone willing to bring it back. The sun set over the valley one evening. The fields stretched out in every direction. Green where white once ruled. Alive where nothing once grew. Daniel stood at the edge of his land. The same place he had stood years ago, when everyone else left. He looked out across it all, then down at the soil beneath his boots. No white crust, no lifeless dust, just earth, and something growing. Because sometimes, the difference between dead land and living land isn't the soil, it's the person who refuses to give up on it.